The Calvados Castle, Haun, Iongy, Normandy, France, October 12th, 1875. The master of the house sat alone at his writing desk, the candle beside him throwing long shadows across the stone walls. Outside, the grounds of the chateau were silent, a kind of silence that settles over the French countryside in the deepest part of autumn, when the trees have given up their leaves and the air carries the first real bite of winter. He dipped his pen and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. He had been keeping this diary for some time now, not out of literary ambition, not because he imagined anyone would ever read it. He kept it because something was happening inside this castle that he could not explain, and the only tool he had left was documentation. If he wrote it down, he told himself it was real. If it was real, there had to be an answer. He was an educated man, a nobleman, a rational person living in a rational century. He believed in science. He believed in the church. He believed that every effect had a cause. He finished the date and sat back. Then, from somewhere above him, it started. A sound, coming from the staircase. Not footsteps, exactly. Something between footsteps and something else entirely. Later, in this very diary, he would describe it as the sound of two legs walking on stumps rather than feet. A heavy, wet, lurching rhythm, moving at a speed no human body should be capable of. From the entrance hall to the first floor, along the passage, up to the second floor. The entire castle shaking slightly with each impact. And then came the blows. 10 of them, resounding, thunderous, striking the walls, the doors, the very foundations of the building. Everything around him shook. His candle flickered. He sat completely still, pen still in hand, and listened as the thing above him made itself. Known with a violence that left no room for doubt, he began to write, because that was all he could do. Write it down, make it real, find the answer. He never did find the answer, but he wrote everything down. And tonight we're going to read it. Welcome to Logic Blood Opera. Tonight we're going somewhere a little different. We're leaving America behind and crossing the Atlantic, heading deep into the Norman countryside of northern France, to a chateau that was, by any measure, the site of one of the most intense, most sustained, and most thoroughly documented hauntings ever recorded anywhere. In history, this is the case of Calvados Castle, and what makes it extraordinary is not just what happened there. It's the fact that the man it happened to wrote down almost everything in real time in a private diary that was never intended to be published, which means he had absolutely no reason to lie. We'll be going through the full timeline of events, the investigators who came and left, shaken, the multiple exorcism attempts, and the final extraordinary night that drove the family out for good. We'll also take a look at what researchers have made of the case in the years since, and try to figure out, as best we can, what was actually happening inside those walls. As always, grab something warm, get comfortable, and dim the lights a little. This one deserves the atmosphere. To understand this case, you need to understand the building and the people inside it. Calvados Castle, known more precisely as Chateau de Noyers du Turner, sits in the Calvados region of Normandy, in the north of France. It's a relatively modest chateau by French standards, built in 1835 on the ruins of an earlier medieval structure. Its stones pulled from whatever remained of whatever came before it. It's surrounded by open grounds, farmland, the kind of landscape that stretches away in every direction and makes you feel very aware of how far you are from anywhere else. The family who came to own it in October 1867 were the de Manvilles, though for years the case was documented under the pseudonym MDX, at the specific request of the family, who did not want their name attached to what was happening. This detail alone tells you something. These were not people seeking attention. They were not trying to sell a story or generate interest. They were a respectable French noble family living quietly in the countryside. And whatever was happening inside their home was something they were deeply, deeply ashamed of. De Manville was the head of the household, by all accounts a serious, intelligent, methodical man. His wife, Madame de Manville, was equally respected. Living with them were their son Maurice, a young boy at the time, and a rotating cast of household staff, servants, a coachman named Emile, a gardener named Auguste, and, crucially, a series of live-in tutors hired to oversee Maurice's education. It is worth noting that in the first years after the family moved in, nothing unusual happened at all. They settled in. They made the house their own. Life in the Calvados countryside was quiet and uneventful, and M.D. Manville had every reason to believe it would stay that way. For almost a decade it did. Then, in the autumn of 1875, something woke up. The first person to experience anything unusual in the house was not a member of the family. It was a tutor, one in a line of several who had come to live and work at the chateau over the years. His name has been lost to time, but what he reported is not. He was alone in his room one evening when he saw a chair move, not fall, not wobble on uneven floorboards, move, deliberately, across the floor. He watched it happen, and he said nothing, because what was there to say? He was a rational man working for a rational family in a rational house, and rational chairs did not move on their own. He filed it away. He told himself it was a trick of the light or tiredness or imagination. That same night, he heard the banging loud, rhythmic, coming from the walls of his bedroom, not pipes, not the settling sounds of an old building finding its foundations, something striking the walls from inside. He got up, checked the room, found nothing, went back to bed, and lay awake listening to it for hours. The next night it was louder, and it wasn't just his room anymore. Within days, the entire household could hear it. Great crashing blows, resonating through the walls and floors of the chateau as though something enormous was moving through the interior of the building itself. M.D. Manville investigated methodically. He walked every room. He checked every wall. He examined every possible structural or mechanical explanation. He found nothing, and so he did what any responsible, record-keeping nobleman would do. He opened a diary and he started to write. What followed over the next several months was, by any standard, extraordinary. The diary entries from late October and November 1875 describe a haunting that escalated with terrifying consistency, as though whatever was inside the chateau was testing its limits, discovering what it could do, and becoming bolder night by night. The banging continued, every night, beginning after dark and continuing into the early hours, moving through the castle with no predictable pattern, sometimes in the walls, sometimes on the ceiling above the bedrooms, sometimes directly on the doors, as though something was knocking to be let in. The blows were so powerful they shook the building to its foundations. The chandelier in the dining room swung, objects rattled on shelves. On one occasion, a large ceramic plate shattered on the floor outside Madame de Manville's room. No one had placed it there. No one had ever seen it before. Then came the sounds, screaming, long, drawn out, coming from outside the castle walls at night. The cry of a woman in distress, calling for help from the grounds. Every time someone went to look, the grounds were empty. The sound of a man's voice in the first-floor passage. The diary entry for that night reads, "At 12:55, we heard the voice of a man in the passage. It seemed to cry, 'Ha, ha.' Then immediately there were 10 resounding blows, shaking everything all around. And then there was the thing on the stairs. M. de Manville described it on multiple occasions. The sound of something ascending and descending. The staircase at inhuman speed. Not walking, not running in any recognizable sense. Something with a gait that felt wrong. He wrote that it sounded like a being walking on stumps rather than feet. A heavy, lurching, rhythmic impact that shook the staircase with each contact. It would travel from the entrance hall to the first floor, along the passage, up to the second floor and back again, sometimes for hours. Everyone in the house heard it. The servants, the tutor, the family, all of them heard it, night after night. And none of them could explain it. By November, the haunting had spread into daylight hours. The sound of a woman sobbing and muttering could be heard moving through the chateau in the afternoons. Words were occasionally distinguishable, references to demons, to the damned. The dogs refused to go near the staircase. On 2 occasions, they were found cowering in the far corner of the grounds, whimpering at nothing visible. M.D. Manville bought 2 watchdogs specifically to patrol the grounds. He believed, or perhaps wanted to believe, that human agents were responsible, that someone was trying to frighten his family out of the property. He set the dogs loose at night and watched the gates. The dogs barked once toward a thicket in the garden, then went silent. When he approached the thicket, it was empty. The dogs refused to return to that corner of the grounds for the rest of their lives. He was running out of rational explanations. By January 1876. M.D. Manville had done everything a reasonable man could do. He had searched the castle. He had hired investigators. He had tried to catch a human perpetrator and found none. He had watched his family deteriorate under the weight of months of broken sleep and constant fear. He contacted the church. The local parish priest came first. He spent a night in the chateau, heard the heavy footsteps descending the stairs in the early hours, and left the following morning visibly shaken. He reported to the bishop. The bishop sent a canon, a higher-ranking clergyman, a man of significant spiritual authority by the name of Father H.L. What happened next is perhaps the strangest detail in the entire case. The moment Father H.L. entered the chateau, the haunting stopped completely, entirely. Not a single sound, not a knock, not a footstep, not a scream from the grounds. The building fell into the kind of silence it had not experienced in months. The family slept, the servants slept. The dogs came back to the staircase. For the duration of Father H.L.'s stay at the chateau, the entity, whatever it was, made absolutely no appearance whatsoever. The canon stayed for 10 days, and then he left. He had barely cleared the gate when the sound came from the first floor passage. A heavy impact, like a body falling, followed immediately by what sounded like a rolling ball striking the door of the green room with tremendous force. The haunting had returned, and it was angry. If the haunting before Father H.L.'s visit had been terrifying. What came after was WOVRSEM. De Manville left the chateau briefly in late January to visit his brother, leaving his wife alone with the servants. Madame de Manville took over the diary during his absence, and her entries are among the most disturbing in the entire record. She wrote of a bellowing sound that filled the chateau at night, not the voice of a person, not screaming, something lower, more animal, like the roar of a bull, echoing through the stone corridors. A drumming sound, the noise of something striking the staircase repeatedly with an object, like a heavy stick being dragged across each step when M.D. Manville returned. The entity seemed to notice. The diary entry for the night of his return describes the worst episode yet. It forced its way into the rooms of Auguste the gardener and Emile the coachman. Their beds were overturned while they were in them. Books and maps and papers from M.D. Manville's study were swept from the shelves and heaped on the floor. The midnight screams reached a new pitch. Animal sounds joined them, growling, the bellowing of a bull, sounds that the family struggled to put into language. And for the first time, the entity turned its attention to Maurice. The child. It came to his door. It knocked. Not the thunderous blows it delivered to the walls and floors, something quieter, almost polite, as though it was asking. Maurice heard it and refused to answer. His parents sat outside his door through the night. De Manville wrote in his diary, "I do not know what this thing wants. I do not know how to make it leave. I'm beginning to believe we cannot make it leave." With the haunting now entering its most violent phase, M.D. Manville appealed to the church for something stronger than a blessing. He requested exorcisms. Several were carried out over the following months by the appropriate ecclesiastical authorities. The church officials who investigated the case were unambiguous in their assessment. The nature of the haunting, they said, was, in their words, diabolically supernatural. This was not a phrase the church used lightly. These were not credulous country priests. These were senior clergy, trained in the rigorous discernment of supernatural claims. And they looked at what was happening inside Calvados Castle and called it demonic. The exorcisms initially appeared to work. After each ritual, calm would descend. 2 days, 3 days, sometimes almost a week. The family would breathe, the servants would sleep, the dogs would settle. And then, as reliably as winter following autumn, it would begin again. Quietly at first, a knock in the night, a sound from the staircase, and then building over days back to its full terrible intensity. This happened multiple times. The family had a novena of masses said at Lourdes on their behalf. It made no difference. Whatever was inside the chateau absorbed the spiritual intervention, directed at it, and resumed operations as though nothing had occurred. De Manville was a man of faith. The failure of these rituals did not shake that faith, but it shook something else. His certainty his sense that there was a category of things that could not reach him inside the life he had built. That was the real damage the haunting inflicted. Not the sleepless nights, not the physical disruption, but the quiet, patient dismantling of the conviction that the world made sense. By the late summer of 1876. The haunting had been running for almost a year. It had not stopped. It had not weakened in any meaningful, lasting sense. It had absorbed every investigation, every clerical intervention, every rational attempt at explanation, and continued. The family was exhausted. Their staff was traumatized. Their son Maurice had developed a profound and lasting fear of the staircase that led to the upper floors of his own home. Madame de Manville had stopped sleeping in her room alone. The final event that pushed the family to their decision came on an evening in late Uga. A UGUSTM de Manville opened the door to the drawing room and stopped. Every piece of furniture in the room had been moved, not scattered or thrown, as objects sometimes were during the worst nights, arranged, deliberately and precisely arranged in a horseshoe shape, with the couch placed at the center, as though something had prepared a meeting space and was waiting for the household to take their seats. He stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at it. Then he walked to his harmonium, a small organ-like instrument, sat down and played. For a long time he played, perhaps because there was nothing else to do, perhaps because music was the only thing left that felt like it belonged to him. When he finished and the last note faded, something on the opposite side of the room began to play, the same piece, from a corner of the room that contained nothing, no instrument, no person, just the music repeating itself back to him in the silent chateau, as clear and precise as if someone were sitting there performing it. That was the last entry in the diary. The de Manville family packed what they could carry, sold the castle, and left. The records do not indicate whether the property sold cheaply. They do not indicate whether subsequent owners experienced anything unusual. What they do indicate is that Manville lived out the remainder of his life without ever publicly speaking about what had happened, and that the diary was only brought to wider attention in 1893 when a searcher named M.J. Morris published an account of the events in the Annales des Sciences Psychiques, a French journal dedicated to psychical research. The family name was omitted, at the family's request. So, what was happening inside Calvados Castle? The easy answer is fraud. Someone in the household was responsible. Someone was knocking on walls in the night, rearranging furniture, producing sounds, faking the entire thing for reasons we can only speculate about. It's the answer that requires the least disruption to our understanding of the world. And it's the answer that many researchers have defaulted to. But it doesn't hold up particularly well to scrutiny. This was not a case where a family told stories. Two journalists. It was a private diary, written nightly, over the course of a year, with no indication the family ever intended it to be read. The number of witnesses makes individual fraud implausible. Servants, tutors, clergy, investigators, visiting family members all reported the same phenomena independently. The church authorities who investigated and described the haunting as diabolically supernatural had every institutional reason to be skeptical and reach a rational conclusion. They did not. Then there are the details that resist straightforward explanation entirely. The 10 days of absolute silence during Father Hachel's visit. The immediate resumption of activity the moment he left. The harmonium. That furniture, arranged in a horseshoe. Some researchers have pointed to the medieval ruins on which the chateau was built as a potential explanatory framework. The idea of a location retaining some form of energy or imprint from earlier events. Others have focused on the psychological dimension, the possibility that the stress and fear within the household generated some form of collectively perceived experience that cannot be attributed to deliberate deception. Parapsychologists who have studied the case in depth note that it shares significant features with other well-documented poltergeist cases. The escalation pattern, the response to religious intervention, the sense of an intelligence behind the phenomena, the way it seemed on multiple occasions to be performing for the household, the voice crying "ha ha" before the 10 blows, the harmonium playing back the music it had just been taught. Whatever was inside Calvados Castle, it appeared to be paying attention. The case was published. It was discussed in the psychical research community of the late 19th century. And then, like so many things that fail to fit comfortably into the story we tell about how the world works, it was quietly set aside. The chateau still stands in Normandy. There are no ghost tours, no markers, no documentation at the site of what took place there across that long, terrible year. Most people who pass through the Calvados countryside have never heard of it. But the diary still exists, and if you ever find yourself inclined to dismiss what it contains, consider this. De Manville wrote it knowing no one would read it. He wrote it through a year of experiences that terrified his family, exhausted his faith, and dismantled his sense of reality, and he never once stopped documenting it with the careful, methodical precision of a man who still believed, even at the very end, that somewhere in the evidence there had to be an answer. We didn't find one. Maybe you will. But Calvados was not alone. Across the channel, in a small terraced house in the north of England, something just as dark was making itself known. And this time, it wasn't content to stay in the walls. The Black Monk of Pontefract, Pontefract, West Yorkshire, England, September 1966. Diane Pritchard was 15 years old the night something grabbed her by the throat. She had been in bed. The house on East Drive was quiet, her parents downstairs, her brother in his room. It was an ordinary night in an ordinary terraced house on an ordinary street in a small northern English town that had seen better days. There was nothing remarkable about the Pritchard family, nothing that marked them out. They were decent, working people living a decent working life, and nothing in their experience had prepared them for what was about to happen. Diane felt the pressure first around her throat. Not a hand, exactly. Something that functioned like a hand. Something that gripped with intention and purpose and pulled. She was lifted, not far, but enough. Enough that her feet left the mattress, and she understood in that moment, with complete and terrible clarity, that whatever was in the room with her was not human and was not afraid of her, and did not care what she thought about any of it. She screamed. Her parents came running by the time they reached her room. Diane was back on the bed, gasping. A red mark around her throat that would take days to fade. It was not the first time something had happened in that house. It would not be the last. What the Pritchard family endured over the following years became one of the most extensively witnessed, most thoroughly documented, and most viscerally terrifying poltergeist cases in British history. Investigators came, journalists came, priests came. None of them left unchanged. And the thing that lived at 30 East Drive, the thing that the family came to call the Black Monk of Pontefract, never left at all. This is their story. The house at 30 East Drive was built in the 1950s as part of a post-war social housing development on the edge of Pontefract, a market town in West Yorkshire with a history stretching back to the Norman conquest. It was modest by any standard. A small terrace property on a quiet residential street, 2 stories, a front garden, neighbors on either side. The kind of house that thousands of working families across the north of England called home without incident or event for generations. The Pritchard family moved in and settled quickly. Joe and John Pritchard, their son Philip, and their daughter Diane, a normal family in a normal house on a normal street. That is the foundation on which everything that followed was built. And it matters, because what happened at 30 East Drive cannot be explained by eccentricity or instability or a family predisposed to supernatural belief. These were grounded, skeptical, northern English people, and they were absolutely terrified. The first disturbances began in the summer of 1966, while Joe and Jean were away on holiday and the children were staying with their grandmother. A fine, white powder began falling from the ceiling of the kitchen, not dust, not plaster. A clean, dry powder that drifted down with no visible source. The grandmother watched it happen and could not explain it. Pools of water appeared on the kitchen floor, not from a leak, not from anything that could be traced, just water appearing with no origin. A local counselor was called, then the local water board. Neither found anything wrong with the property. The powder kept falling, the water kept appearing. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The family assumed it was over. It was not over. When Joe and Jean returned from holiday and life resumed its normal pattern, the house was quiet for a time. Weeks passed. The strange events of the summer faded into the category of things that had no explanation and therefore could not be discussed in any useful way. They had happened. They had stopped. That would have to be enough. Then the lights started going out. Not a power cut, not a blown fuse. Individual lights in individual rooms switching themselves off. Objects began moving. Small things. At first, a plant pot shifted from one side of a shelf to the other. A piece of cutlery found in a different drawer from where it had been left. The kind of thing that makes you question your own memory before. It makes you question anything else. Then the green chalk marks began appearing on surfaces throughout the house. On walls, on the floor, on furniture, not words, shapes, patterns. As though something was marking its territory. Joe Pritchard scrubbed them off. They came back. He scrubbed them off again. They came back again, in slightly different places. As though whatever was making them was aware that the previous marks had been removed and had chosen new locations. Deliberately, the family began to understand that this was not going to stop on its own. What followed over the next several years was a haunting of extraordinary intensity and variety, documented by the family, by investigators, by journalists, and by a significant number of independent witnesses who visited the property and experienced the phenomena firsthand. The entity at 30 East Drive was physical in a way that most reported poltergeists are not. It did not confine itself to sounds and moved objects. It interacted directly with the people in the house. It pulled hair. It slapped faces. It pushed people down the stairs. Jean Pritchard was dragged across the kitchen floor by an invisible force on multiple occasions, the linoleum burning the skin of her legs as she went. Joe was struck. Philip was struck. Visitors were struck. And then there was the figure. Multiple witnesses reported seeing it. A tall, dark shape. Dressed, some said, in the habit of a monk, a long hooded robe that swept the floor as it moved. It appeared in corridors, on the landing, at the top of the stairs. It was seen by the family. It was seen by neighbors. It was seen by a local vicar who came to investigate and left the property in a state of visible distress, refusing to discuss what he had encountered inside. The figure became the basis for the name that eventually attached itself to the case. The Black Monk of Pontefract, the local history of the area provided a potential context that researchers would later find deeply unsettling. Pontefract had been the site of a Cluniac priory in the medieval period. The Cluniac monks wore black. Habits and records existed suggesting that a monk from that priory had been hanged on the grounds near where East Drive was eventually built. Hanged for a crime so serious that the church itself had sanctioned his execution. Whether that history had any connection to what was happening at number 30 was impossible to say with certainty. But the figure in the black habit kept appearing. And it kept getting closer. Diane Pritchard bore the worst of it. She was the primary focus of the entity's physical attention in a way that disturbed every investigator who studied the case. She was pulled from her bed. She was dragged up the stairs by her hair while family members watched, powerless to stop it. The force too strong for several adults to overcome, even when they grabbed her and pulled in the opposite direction. She was thrown. She was held against walls. And there was the incident with the throat, not once, but on multiple occasions, that grip around her neck, lifting her, reminding her that whatever lived in that house had decided she was its particular concern. She was a teenager. She endured it for years. The investigators who came to 30 East Drive were not amateurs looking for a story. Among them was Tom Cuniff, a local man with a background in psychical research, who spent significant time at the property and documented what he witnessed with methodical care. He watched objects move. He watched the figure appear at the top of the stairs. He watched Diane be pulled across the landing by something he could not see and could not stop. He did not debunk the case. He could not. Journalists from national newspapers visited. Some left skeptical, some did not. The case attracted attention from the broader paranormal research community, and the family found themselves at the center of an investigation that brought strangers through their front door. On a regular basis, strangers who came looking for proof and frequently found more than they had bargained for. The church was contacted. A local vicar came first and left shaken. A more senior clergyman was brought in. He performed a blessing of the property. The activity paused briefly and then resumed with its characteristic indifference to human intervention, as though the blessing had been noted and dismissed. An exorcism was eventually attempted. The entity responded by throwing the priest's Bible across the room. Through all of it, the Pritchard family stayed. They had nowhere else to go. The house was their home, their council tenancy, the roof over their children's heads. They could not simply leave. And so they endured, year after year, a cohabitation with something that had no interest in their comfort or their sanity or their safety, something that had claimed that property as its own and regarded the family inside it as an inconvenience at best and a source of entertainment at worst. The activity eventually began to diminish in the early 1970s. Not suddenly, not dramatically. It wound down slowly, the way a storm passes, the worst of it receding, leaving behind a kind of exhausted silence that the family were almost too tired to appreciate. By the mid-1970s, 30 East Drive was quiet. The Pritchards stayed in the house for the rest of their lives. The case of the Black Monk of Pontefract did not fade quietly into the archive of unexplained events the way so many haunting cases do. It persisted. It was written about, investigated, and revisited by researchers over the decades that followed. It was the subject of a book by Colin Wilson, one of Britain's most respected writers on the paranormal, who studied the evidence and concluded that the Pontefract case was among the most compelling poltergeist cases he had ever encountered. It was later adapted into a film. The house at 30 East Drive became something of a landmark in the paranormal research community, eventually opening to overnight visitors who could rent the property and spend the night inside it. Some of those visitors reported nothing. Some of them did not come back. What makes the Black Monk of Pontefract so resistant to dismissal is the sheer weight of independent testimony. This was not a case built on the word of one family. Dozens of people witnessed phenomena at that address over the course of the haunting. Neighbors reported seeing the figure from outside the house. Investigators with no prior relationship to the family documented events they could not explain. A vicar who entered the property as a skeptic left it as something else entirely. The physical nature of the haunting is also difficult to account for within any conventional framework. Poltergeist cases frequently involve moved objects and unexplained sounds. Cases involving consistent, repeated physical assault on specific individuals, particularly a child, are far rarer and far harder to attribute to collective misperception or deliberate deception. Diane Pritchard had marks on her body. She had witnesses present during the attacks. Multiple adults attempted to intervene during the incidents in which she was dragged and lifted, and could not stop what was happening. The medieval history of the site remains a thread that no researcher has been able to fully pull on or fully set aside. The Cluniac Priory, the monk, the execution, the black-habited figure seen by multiple independent witnesses in the corridors of a 1950s terraced house in West Yorkshire. Whether these things are connected is a question that the evidence cannot answer definitively in either direction. What can be said with confidence is this: something happened at 30 East Drive between 1966 and the early 1970s that left a family permanently changed, that drove investigators and clergy from the property in states of genuine distress, and that has never been satisfactorily explained by any conventional means in the half-century since it occurred. The house still stands on East Drive. You can still rent it. You can still spend the night inside it. In the rooms where Diane Pritchard was dragged from her bed, on the landing where the figure was seen standing in its black habit, at the top of the stairs where something waited in the dark for years, and showed absolutely no sign of being afraid of anyone who came to face it. Whether it is still there is a question only the dark can answer, and the dark, as always, is not talking. But not every encounter with the unknown happens in the shadows of old stone and cold corridors. Sometimes it happens on a warm summer night in rural America, under a sky full of stars, to a group of ordinary people who made the mistake of stepping outside to look up. The Kelly-Hopkinsville EREOERA, Christian County, Kentucky, August 21st, 1955. Billy Ray Taylor saw something in the water. He had stepped outside the farmhouse just after 7 in the evening to draw water from the well. The night was warm, the kind of thick southern warmth that sits on your skin and doesn't move, and the sky above the fields was clear and full of stars. Billy Ray was a young man, 21 years old, visiting the Sutton family farm with his wife June. It was an ordinary evening. Supper had been eaten. The adults were talking. The children were doing what children do on summer nights in the country. He looked up. What he saw moving across the sky above the tree line was not a star and was not a plane. and was not anything he had a word for. A large, luminous object, he would later tell police, moving with purpose across the sky before dropping below the horizon in the direction of a dry creek bed about a mile from the farmhouse. It didn't crash, it descended. There is a difference, and Billy Ray was clear about it. He went back inside and told the family what he had seen. Elmer Sutton, whose farm it was, listened politely and said nothing much. Men saw things in the sky. Sometimes there were explanations for most of them. The evening continued. Then, about an hour later, the dog started barking. Not the casual bark of a farm dog responding to a night sound. Something different, frantic, sustained. The kind of noise an animal makes when it has encountered something its instincts have no category for. And then just as suddenly, the dog went silent, completely silent. It crawled under the porch and did not come out again for the rest of the night. Billy Ray and Elmer Sutton stepped outside to see what had disturbed it, what they saw coming across. The field toward the farmhouse was small, perhaps 3.5 feet tall, luminous. Its hands were raised in a gesture that looked almost like surrender, but felt like nothing of the sort. Its head was large, its eyes enormous, catching and reflecting the light in a way that animal eyes do not. It moved with a strange, floating quality, as though the ground beneath it was optional. Elmer Sutton raised his shotgun and fired. The creature flipped backward, somersaulted in the air, found its feet, and kept coming. The siege of the Sutton farmhouse had begun. Inside the house were 11 people: Elmer Sutton and his wife Glennie, Billy Ray Taylor and his wife June, several of Elmer's adult children and younger family members. 11 people in a farmhouse in rural Kentucky, and outside in the fields and on the roof and in the trees at the edge of the property. Something that would not leave and would not die, and seemed above all things intensely curious about the people inside. The creatures, because there was more than one, the family would insist on that. More than one, and possibly as many as a dozen, moved around the property with a freedom that the locked doors and drawn curtains did nothing to address. They appeared at windows, pressing their faces against the glass, those enormous reflective eyes looking in at the people looking out. They moved across the roof. The family could hear them up there, a light, scraping movement that tracked from one end of the house to the other. Every time one of the men went outside to confront them, the creatures would retreat just far enough to make a clear shot difficult and then stop, as though they understood the effective range of a shotgun, as though they were assessing. Billy Ray stepped onto the porch at one point and felt something reach down from the roof above him and grab his hair. He threw himself back inside. The hand, if it wasn't hand, released him. The guns were fired again and again throughout the night. Every time a creature was hit, it would flip, roll, right itself, and move away. Not die, not fall and stay. Down, move away temporarily before returning. At one point, Elmer Sutton shot one of the creatures at point-blank range and watched it simply float backward and disappear into the darkness, apparently unharmed. The family barricaded themselves inside and waited. The siege lasted for approximately 3 hours at around 11 o'clock, with the creatures still moving around the property and the family still firing through windows and doorways at whatever came close enough to present a target. Someone made the decision that they could not stay. They loaded into their cars, all 11 of them, and drove the 7 miles to the Hopkinsville police station. What the officers who received them found was not a family playing a prank or chasing attention. What they found were 11 people in varying states of shock and genuine terror, several of them shaking, all of them telling the same story with a consistency that gave the duty officers pause. Chief Greenwell drove out to the Sutton farm with a group of deputies to investigate. They found the farmhouse in the state the family had described, shell casings everywhere, bullet holes in the walls where shots had been fired through windows. The dog still under the porch, still refusing to come out. The grounds around the farmhouse showed signs of disturbance. The officers walked the property with flashlights and found nothing that explained what the family had experienced, and nothing that contradicted their account either. The creatures were gone. The police left around 2 in the morning. The family returned to the farmhouse and tried to sleep. At 3:30, the creatures came back. They were at the windows again. The same enormous eyes, the same luminous quality in the darkness. The family endured another 2 hours of the creatures pressing against the glass and moving across the roof before, as dawn approached, they finally withdrew for good. The Sutton family never asked for what came next. By the following morning, the story had reached the local press. By the day after that, it had gone further. The farm on Old Madisonville Road became a destination. Journalists arrived. Curiosity seekers arrived. The United States Air Force, which was at the time running its Project Blue Book investigation into UFO reports, sent investigators who interviewed the family and subsequently listed the case as unexplained. The family found the attention overwhelming and largely unwelcome. They were not people who had gone looking for this. They had not called the press. They had called the police because something was outside their house and they were frightened. And everything that followed was a consequence of that single frightened decision. On a warm August night in Kentucky, researchers and investigators who studied the case in the years that followed consistently noted the same things. The witnesses were numerous, 11 people, 11 independent accounts that aligned in their core details with a consistency that would have been extraordinarily difficult to fabricate or maintain. Under the pressure of police questioning and journalistic scrutiny, the Suttons were not known for eccentricity or attention-seeking. They were farming people with no history of unusual claims and no obvious motive for inventing one. The physical evidence was real. The shell casings were real. The bullet holes were real. The dog's behavior was real and witnessed independently by the officers who attended the scene. Chief Greenwell, a man with no particular investment in the paranormal, went on record saying he believed the family had experienced something genuine, even if he could not say what. Various explanations were proposed over the years that followed. Great horned owls, whose eyes reflect light and which can appear unexpectedly large in darkness. Escaped circus monkeys. Weather balloons with an unusual appearance in low light. Each of these explanations was examined by researchers and found inadequate in one or more significant respects. Owls do not move across rooftops. Monkeys do not absorb shotgun blasts and continue walking. Weather balloons do not approach farmhouses and press their faces against windows for 3 hours. The explanation that fit the evidence the best was the one that nobody wanted to write down in an official report. That something had landed in the dry creek bed a mile from the Sutton farm on the evening of August 21st, 1955. That whatever came out of it had approached the farmhouse with a curiosity that 11 human beings and a large farm dog found absolutely terrifying. And that, when it was done being curious, it left. The Kelly-Hopkinsville encounter has occupied a specific and durable place in the history of unexplained events for nearly 7 decades. It is not a case that sits comfortably in any single category. It is not quite a haunting. It is not quite a UFO sighting in the conventional sense. It is something stranger and more specific than either a prolonged, physical, interactive encounter between a group of ordinary people and something that behaved with an intelligence and a purpose that the witnesses could not account for, and that investigators could not explain away. What makes it particularly resistant to dismissal is the chain of verification that surrounds it. The family reported to the police immediately while the encounter was still ongoing. The police attended the scene that same night and found evidence consistent with the family's account. The Air Force investigated and could not close the case satisfactorily. Every subsequent investigator who approached the Sutton family found them consistent, credible, and notably reluctant to engage with the attention the case had brought them. Hardly the behavior of people who had invented a story for publicity. Elmer Sutton spent the rest of his life giving essentially the same account of what happened that night. He did not embellish it. He did not expand it into something more dramatic or more convenient for the researchers who came to interview him. He said what he had seen, and what he had seen was something small and luminous that came across the field toward his house and would not be stopped by a shotgun. And that was the truth of it, and he had nothing further to add. Billy Ray Taylor, whose glimpse of something in the sky above the tree line had started the whole evening, also maintained his account without significant variation until his death. He had not gone looking for what he found. He had gone outside to draw water from a well on a warm summer night in Kentucky, and he had looked up and the sky had not been empty, and everything that followed was simply what happened next. The farm on Old Madisonville Road still exists. The area around Hopkinsville has leaned into its connection to the case over the years, and the town hosts an annual festival called Little Green Men Days in honor of the encounter. The name drawn from the press coverage that followed the original. Reports in 1955, coverage that the family found reductive and slightly insulting. They had not described little green men. They had described something luminous and strange and utterly indifferent to the shotgun blasts being directed at it. Something that had looked through their windows with those enormous reflective eyes and found them interesting for reasons they would never understand. Whatever it was that came across the field toward the Sutton farmhouse on that August night, it had somewhere to be after Kentucky. It came, it looked, it left, and it never told anyone what it had seen. But not every encounter with the unknown ends with something leaving. Sometimes it ends with something staying. Sometimes it ends with two men dead on a hill, their eyes covered. Their cause of death a mystery that 6 decades of investigation have done absolutely nothing to solve. The lead masked senator, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. August 20th, 1966. Jorge da Costa Alves was flying his kite. He was a young boy, 11 years old, and the hill above Niterói was a good place for it. The Morro de Vintum Hill rose steeply above the city, its scrubby slopes offering clear sky and enough wind to keep a kite moving. It was a Sunday afternoon. The city below was going about its business. Jorge climbed the hill, the way he always did, following the path he knew, not thinking about anything in particular. Then he saw them. 2 men lying on the grass near the top of the hill, side by side, perfectly still, each of them wearing a suit, each of them wearing a lead mask, a crude, homemade eye covering cut from sheet lead, sitting over their faces like something between a blindfold and a piece of industrial equipment. Around them the grass was undisturbed. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no obvious injury of any kind. Jorge stared at them for a moment. Then he ran. By the time police reached the summit of Vintum Hill, the 2 men had been dead for what investigators estimated was between 2 and 4 days. The heat and humidity of the Brazilian summer had not been kind to the bodies. Identification was established through documents found at the scene. The men were Miguel Jose Viana, age 34, and Manuel Pereira da Cruz, age 32. Both were from the nearby town of Campos. Both were electronic technicians by profession. Both were known to their families as serious, rational, hard-working men with no history of unusual behavior, no known involvement in criminal activity, and no apparent reason to be dead on a hill outside Rio de Janeiro wearing homemade lead masks. Next to the bodies, investigators found a small number of items: an empty bottle of water, a wet towel still damp despite the days that had passed, and a small notebook. The notebook contained a handwritten message that has never been fully explained. It read, 1630, be at the agreed place. 1830, swallow capsules after effect, protect metals, await signal mask. That was all. Police interviewed everyone they could find. They retraced the movements of both men in the days before their deaths with considerable thoroughness. What they established was this. On August 17, 1966, 3 days before Jorge da Costa Alves found the bodies, Miguel and Manuel had traveled together from Campos to Niterói. Before leaving Campos, they had visited a shop and purchased waterproof coats. In Niterói, they visited a bar, where the owner remembered them clearly because one of them purchased a bottle of water and checked his watch repeatedly, as though he was working to a precise schedule. After leaving the bar, they were not seen alive again. The toxicology results when they came back were inconclusive. The condition of the bodies after days of exposure in the Brazilian heat had made a full toxicological analysis impossible. No definitive cause of death was ever established. The official investigation was closed without a satisfactory conclusion. The case was filed as unexplained, but the investigation had turned up one more thing. A witness, a woman who lived near the base of Vintum Hill, reported that on the evening of August 17th, the evening Miguel and Manuel were last seen alive, she'd seen a bright oval object hovering above the summit of the hill, orange light, silent. She watched it for several minutes before it moved away rapidly and disappeared. She was not the only one. Several other residents of the area reported the same thing. Independently, on the same evening. A bright light above the hill. 2 men dead at the summit, lead masks over their eyes. a notebook with instructions that referred to capsules, 2. Metals to a signal, to an agreed place and time, whatever happened on Vintham Hill on the evening of August 17, 1966. No one who was there to see it has ever come forward to explain it. The lead masks themselves became the most discussed and most debated element of the case in the years that followed. Sheet lead as one primary, practical application that investigators and researchers kept returning to. It blocks radiation. Not all radiation, the masks were crude, homemade, covering only the eyes, but the principle of using lead as a shield against certain forms of electromagnetic or radioactive energy is well established. The question that nobody could satisfactorily answer was why 2 electronic technicians from a small Brazilian town would construct homemade lead eye coverings, travel to a hill outside Rio de Janeiro, and die there wearing them. Several theories were proposed, and none of them closed the case. The most straightforward was accidental poisoning. The notebook's reference to swallowing capsules suggested the men had ingested something deliberately. If those capsules contained a substance that proved fatal, whether through miscalculation, contamination, or simple toxicity, then the deaths, while strange, had a physical cause. The lead masks might have been protective equipment for whatever ritual or experiment they were conducting. The problem with this theory was the toxicology. The analysis was inconclusive, not negative. It could not confirm poisoning. It could not rule it out. It simply could not say. The second theory, which gained significant traction in Brazil and internationally, was that Miguel and Manuel had been involved in a spiritist or occultist group of some kind. Brazil in the 1960s had a rich and complex tradition of spiritual practice, and some researchers identified elements of the notebook's instructions as consistent with certain ritual frameworks. The masks in this reading were ceremonial rather than protective. The capsules were part of a ritual ingestion. The agreed place and the signal referred to a spiritual encounter they had expected and gone to the hill to receive, the UFO. Dimension of the case was never officially incorporated into the investigation, but has never gone away either. The witness. Reports of a bright oval object above Vintham Hill on the evening of the deaths are documented, corroborated, and unexplained. Brazilian UFO researchers who studied the case extensively noted that Vintham Hill had a documented history of UFO sightings both before and after 1966, and that the language of the notebook, the signal, the agreed place, the protective metals, was consistent with accounts from other cases involving individuals who believed they were making contact with non-human intelligence. In 1997. More than 30 years after the deaths, a journalist investigating the case tracked down a man who claimed to have been part of the same group as Miguel and Manuel. He said the group had been conducting experiments in communication with extraterrestrial beings. He said the lead masks were protection against the energies involved in those experiments. He said Miguel and Manuel had volunteered to go to the hill that evening because they believed they were ready for the next stage of contact. He said he did not know what had happened to them because he had not been there. He could not be verified. His account could not be confirmed. He was one man, decades later, with a story that explained everything and proved nothing. The case of the lead masks has been investigated by Brazilian police, by journalists, by UFO researchers, by paranormal investigators, and by documentary makers across 6 decades. It has never been closed. It has never been explained. The cause of death of Miguel Jose Viana and Manuel Pereira de Cruz remains officially undetermined. 2 electronic technicians. A hill above Rio de Janeiro. Homemade lead masks over their eyes. A notebook with instructions for something that was supposed to happen and apparently did. A bright light in the sky above the hill on the evening they died. Seen by multiple witnesses, explained by none of them. Whatever they were waiting for on that hill, it came. Whether it was what they expected is a question that died with them. But, at least in Brazil, the strange events happened in darkness, on a remote hill, away from the eyes of the world. What happened next on our list occurred in broad daylight, in front of police officers, fire investigators, chemists, and crowds of journalists who traveled specifically to watch it and left without a single explanation between them. The fire poltergeist of Bladenboro, North Carolina, January 1932. Cullen Williamson was not a man given to panic. He was a farmer, 43 years old, built for hard work, steady by nature, the kind of man who had seen enough of life's difficulties to know that most problems had practical solutions if you kept your head and looked hard enough. His wife Lita was the same. They had raised their family in a modest farmhouse outside Bladenboro, a small tobacco town in the flat coastal plain of North Carolina, and they had never had cause to think of themselves as anything other than ordinary people living an ordinary life. That changed on the morning of January 8th, 1932. It started with the window curtains. Lida Williamson was in the front room of the farmhouse when the curtains beside the window simply caught fire. No flame had been near them, no lamp, no candle, no spark from the fireplace. The curtains were not close enough to any heat source for any conventional explanation to apply. They simply began to burn, the fabric blackening and curling from a point in the middle of the material, as though the fire had started from inside the cloth itself. Cullen threw water on them and put the fire out. 20 minutes later, a chair in the corner of the same room began to smoke. He put that out too. Then a bed in the back room caught fire. Then a pile of clothes on the bedroom floor. Then the curtains in the kitchen. By the end of that first day, 20 separate fires had broken out inside the Williamson farmhouse. Every one of them was extinguished before it could spread. Every one of them had started with no ignition source that anyone in the house could identify. By nightfall, Cullen Williamson had put out 20 fires in his own home and had no explanation for a single one of them. He contacted the local fire department. The fire chief came the following morning and stayed for several hours. During his visit, 3 more fires broke out in his presence. He watched them start. He saw, as clearly as Cullen and Lida had seen the day before, that there was no conventional ignition source. The fires simply began on fabric and furniture and clothing, as though the material itself had decided to combust. The fire chief had no explanation. He contacted the county. The county sent investigators. Word reached the local newspaper, and from that point, the Williamson farmhouse became something it had never been before and never asked to be, a public spectacle, drawing crowds of people from across the county and beyond, all of them arriving to watch a farmhouse catch fire by itself, and none of them leaving with any better understanding of why it was happening. The investigators who came to Bladenboro in the days that followed were not amateurs or credulous bystanders. They were professionals with specific expertise in exactly the kind of question the Williamson case was raising. Fire investigators came and examined the structure of the building for any possible conventional source of spontaneous ignition, faulty wiring, chemical contamination of the materials, proximity to heat sources. They found nothing. Insurance. Adjusters came, motivated by the very practical question of whether the fires were being set deliberately. They found no evidence of arson and no evidence of any mechanical or chemical device that could have produced the fires remotely or covertly. Chemists came and took samples of the burned materials, testing them for any accelerant or compound that might explain the combustion. The tests came back negative. A physicist from a nearby university visited the farm and spent 2 days conducting observations. He watched 7 fires start during his time at the property. He was unable to explain any of them. His written account of the visit, which was preserved in local records, noted with considerable understatement that the phenomena observed did not conform to any known physical principle he was aware of. The fires showed a consistent pattern that investigators noted and could not account for. They always started on fabric, curtains, clothing, bedding, upholstered furniture. They always began from a central point in the material rather than at an edge, which was the opposite of how fires caused by proximity to a heat source typically behaved. They spread slowly rather than rapidly, as though something was controlling the rate of combustion, and they stopped every time the moment water was applied, with a completeness and immediacy that several witnesses described as unnatural, as though the fire had not exhausted its fuel but had simply decided to go out. The Williamson family were examined as thoroughly as their home. Every member of the household was assessed for any possible role in producing the fires. The conclusion of every investigator who conducted this assessment was the same. Cullen and Lida Williamson were straightforward, credible people with no motive to set fire to their own home and no opportunity to have done so in the cases witnessed directly by investigators. Their children were similarly assessed and similarly cleared. There was one detail that several investigators noticed, and none of them could fully integrate into any conventional framework. The fires seemed to follow people. Specifically, they seemed most likely to occur in whatever room of the house was currently occupied. When investigators moved from room to room, the fire activity tended to shift with them. When the house was empty, on the one occasion when all occupants left the property for several hours and investigators remained outside watching, no fires were reported. When the family returned, the fires resumed within the hour. This observation pointed in a direction that none of the official investigators were comfortable pointing in publicly. It suggested that whatever was causing the fires was not a property of the building itself, but was in some way connected to the people inside it. It was this observation, more than any other, that led later researchers to classify the Bladenboro case as a poltergeist phenomenon rather than a purely physical anomaly. The same classification that had been applied to Pontefract, to Calvados, to dozens of other cases where inexplicable physical events clustered around specific individuals in specific locations and resisted every conventional attempt at explanation. The Bladenboro fires attracted national press attention at their peak. Reporters from newspapers as far away as New York made the journey to the small North Carolina farming town to cover the story. The level of documentation generated by the case was extraordinary for the period. Multiple professional investigators, multiple independent witness accounts, physical evidence in the form of burned materials, and a public record that has survived intact in local and state archives. And yet the case is almost entirely unknown outside of specialist paranormal research. Circles. It does not have the cultural footprint of Amityville or Enfield. It has not been adapted into a film or a television series. There is no landmark on the site of the Williamson farmhouse. Most people who drive through Bladenboro today have never heard of what happened there in January 1932, and the town itself has long since moved on to other concerns. The fires stopped as suddenly as they had started. After approximately 2 weeks of daily outbreaks, the combustions simply ceased. The Williamson farmhouse went back to being a normal farmhouse. The investigators packed up and went home. The journalists filed their final stories and moved on to other news. The official reports were completed and filed and concluded without exception, with some variation of the same phrase, because unknown. No explanation was ever established. No mechanism was ever identified. No theory was ever proposed that accounted for all of the observed facts without requiring assumptions that the evidence did not support. 20 fires in a single day, witnessed by police, confirmed by chemists, observed by a university physicist who could not explain what he saw, occurring on fabric starting from the center outward, stopping immediately when water was applied, clustering around the presence of the family in a way that suggested intelligence rather than chemistry. Whatever moved through the Williamson farmhouse in January 1932, it left no trace of itself behind. No cause, no name, no explanation. Just the burn marks on the curtains, and the memory of a farmer who spent 2 weeks putting out fires that had no right to exist, in a house that had never done anything to deserve them. Some things happen. They are witnessed. They are documented. They are investigated by serious people with professional credentials and genuine motivation to find the truth. And sometimes, at the end of all of that, the only honest thing left to say is this: we do not know. We were there. We saw it, we wrote it down. And we do not know.